Hi and welcome to part 2 of our controlling mini lecture series. In this mini lecture, we're going to talk about 3 approaches to design and control systems and the broad types of controls that managers can utilize. So, what are the 3 types of approaches to design and control systems? The first one is called feed-forward control. So a feed-forward control is the type of control that takes place before a work activity is done in order to prevent anticipatory problems. So for example, before you take a job as a lifesaver, you have to have a CPR and first aid certificate. That is a feed-forward control. It's designed to eliminate the potential for problems later on in the process if you haven't done that. So for example, you get there on your first day as a lifeguard at Wet n Wild and a child drowns or almost drowns, and your job is to jump in the water, save them, perform CPR and life-saving activities on them. If you haven't done the certificate, then that's going to be a big problem in this process. So that's why they put that at the front before you start that activity. So the question that organisations ask themselves is, what needs to be done before we begin this process? Concurrent controls are those enacted while the work is being performed. Right? So we can go around and do OHS checks, for example, on light fittings and electrical products to make sure that they're safe. They're called steering controls. All right? So they're monitoring to make sure that our operations and activities are actually being done according to plan and people are using the right process at all times. All right? So the question that's asked here is, what can we do to improve things before we finish? Right? We don't want to get to the end and realize that our Holden is missing a motor. So it's about checking as we go through. Now, another example of concurrent control using that Holden example is a check sheet. So someone may actually be responsible for going around and saying, yes, the paint is on, yes, it's dry, we've put the windshield on, we've put the motor in, we've done all this. So they actually perform checks during that process. A feedback control is one that's done after the work activity has been already completed. So they're called post-action controls or feedback controls. The idea is that we're looking at the end results. Now, you've all created or participated in a survey of an activity. For example, it could be your student evaluations, or it could be fill in this form to tell us how great we are. So think about Facebook when you do a Facebook call. At the end of every call, they have that 5-point star system. That's a feedback control. And the idea is that organisations are asking themselves constantly, now that we've finished that one task, how well did we do? And that's really important because all of these feed into our future actions. So the second question that's asked is, what are the broad types of controls that managers can use? Now, in an organisation, you can have an internal or an external control. An internal control is one that an employee has within them. So it could be self-discipline, self-control. The idea is that you're relying on a motivated individual to exercise self-control over their own behaviour. So they have to follow the process. Think about things like an employee who cooks chicken in the oven. Now, they pull out the chicken from the oven, and they stick a temperature controller in, and it has to be above a certain level, right? So they could, of course, stick it in, realize it's probably not at the temperature, but you can't write that on paper, make up a figure on paper, or they might have forgotten to do it last time, so they might make up the figures. We all know this happens, but hopefully not that often. But it does, an internal control is designed to, an employee has to have that internal control to do the right thing all the time. An external control is where we don't rely on that internal person doing the right thing, we check things. So these things could be done through direct supervision or administrative systems such as rules and procedures. All right, so and the managers take action to control the behaviour. So if someone is consistently not checking those chickens and they're making up figures, then it's the manager's job to performance manage that. So a bureaucratic control is a classical form of external control. So the idea is that if I'm going to be bureaucratic about these things, you will see lots of authority, lots of policies, procedures, job description, budgets, day-to-day supervision in order to check constantly that you're on the right track. All right, so we're also getting all of these forms and procedures from the external environment, It could be the government changes or the government laws or regulations that govern the behaviour. And in doing so, we're constantly checking through these documents. Another type of control is a clan control. All right, so within an organisation, there's this thing called organisational culture, and we'll talk about that in our diversity lecture coming up. But a culture influences the behaviour through norms and expectations, right? And when you get into a team, the way in which you do things in that team differs to the way in which you do things in another team. But in a clan control, that power of the collective identity actually tells you how to behave. Now, if everyone is not going to be checking the chickens consistently and writing down the right temperature, then that becomes the norm, right? Whereas if in a situation where everyone is doing it and this one person isn't and someone else pulls them up on their behaviour, then it becomes the abnormal to not do it. So in that case, that person will change their behaviour. So a clan control is basically the group expectation of what we expect other people to behave in where we are. And that impacts the way in which we work, because ultimately, if we're in an environment where our group tells us to do one thing and an organisation tells us to do another, there are some disparities about what we should be doing and who should be doing it. But it is certainly a control factor. Another type of control is a market control. So the influence of market competition on the behaviour of organisations and their members. Think about Coles and Woolworths. When one changes their price, another follows. I mean, recently this week, Woolworths announced that they were not going to do $1 milk anymore, and they were going to put it up because that money could be sent to the farmers. However, Coles, for the first time, didn't respond to what Woolworths was doing and instead said, we can still keep the price of milk low, but we can support our farmers in other ways, and they were choosing different ways. Now, this is one way in which both Coles and Woolworths had to respond to this farmer demand need. And they responded differently, but they also responded. So it's a great example of how market competition changes the behaviour of an organisation who otherwise probably wouldn't have helped those farmers. You can see the influence that market control has in the way in which they adjust products, pricing, promotions, and other practices. So think about things like the petrol industry. Now, we know that the petrol is overpriced. It's been happening for years. However, what you tend to find is that when one, say BP puts their prices up, Shell puts their prices up, and then United is the last one to come on board. But there's this idea that when one organisation does something in a market and they've got majority of control, then the others tend to adjust accordingly. Right? You can see these things in promotion packages as well. So you've got 4 cents a litre off of Coles Shell, and you've got 4 cents a litre off on the Woolworths branded petrol. One responded to the other. All right. So market controls are really strong in organisations in order to get things done, and are useful for us. So this mini lecture was really focused on the different approaches to design and control systems, and they were market, bureaucratic, clan as the 3 main approaches. And we also talked about the control types such as feed forward, concurrent, and feedback.